This is the story of how the greatest empire in history slowly collapsed, not in a single battle, not in one dramatic moment, but over centuries. At its peak, Rome controlled most of the known world, from Britain in the north to North Africa in the south, from Spain all the way to the Middle East. Around 60 million people lived under Roman rule. Its roads connected entire continents. Its army was disciplined, organized, and feared. Trade flowed through the Mediterranean. Grain ships fed the capital. Taxes filled the treasury. To the people living inside it, Rome looked permanent, stable, unshakable. But power at that scale hides weaknesses. And long before Rome fell, the problems had already begun. Rome did not begin to collapse in the 5th century. The real damage started much earlier. In 235 AD, Emperor Severus Alexander was assassinated by his own soldiers. It was not an unusual death for a Roman ruler, but what followed was different. Over the next 50 years, the empire would see more than 20 emperors. Most of them did not die peacefully. Many ruled for only a few months. The army had discovered something dangerous. It could make and unmake emperors. Loyalty shifted constantly. Generals declared themselves ruler in one province, only to be replaced by another commander months later. Civil wars drained the treasury. Borders were left undefended. Rome was still powerful, but it was no longer stable. While Rome fought itself, pressure was building beyond its borders. Along the Rhine and Danube, Germanic tribes were reorganizing. They were no longer scattered groups. They were forming larger confederations. The Goths began crossing into Roman territory, not just raiding settling. Then came the Huns. Their sudden arrival from the Eurasian steppe pushed entire populations westward. Rome was not facing simple invasions anymore. It was facing mass migration. In 378 AD, at the Battle of Adrianople, the Roman army was crushed. Emperor Valens was killed on the battlefield. It was one of the worst defeats in Roman history. The myth of Roman invincibility was broken. By the end of the 4th century, governing the empire had become nearly impossible from a single center. When Emperor Theodosius I died in 395 AD, the empire was divided between his two sons. The eastern half would be ruled from Constantinople, the western half from Rome and later Ravenna. The division seemed practical. It was meant to strengthen control, but the two halves were not equal. The east had wealth, strong cities, and defensible borders. The west had fewer resources and longer frontiers to protect. Over time, the gap widened. The Eastern Empire adapted. The Western Empire struggled. In 410 AD, something happened that no Roman believed possible. The city of Rome was captured by the Visigoths under Alaric. For nearly 8 centuries, Rome had stood untouched by foreign armies. It had defeated Carthage, conquered Greece, destroyed rival kingdoms. Now its gates were opened from within. The looting lasted 3 days. Churches were spared in many cases. The destruction was not total, but that was not the point. The symbol had fallen. Across the Mediterranean world, people ask the same question. If Rome can be sacked, is the empire truly safe? The mid-5th century brought a new kind of fear. Attila, leader of the Huns, commanded a force unlike anything Rome had faced before. Fast cavalry, ruthless campaigns, psychological terror. Cities in the Balkans were destroyed. Tribute was demanded from Constantinople. The Western Empire could not afford open war. In 451 AD, Roman forces and their Germanic allies stopped Attila in Gaul at the Battle of the Catalonian Plains. It was a costly victory, one of the last major coordinated defenses of the West. But Rome was now surviving crisis after crisis. Survival was no longer the same as strength. Rome had been built on expansion. Conquest brought land, wealth, slaves, and tribute. For centuries, the system fed itself. But when expansion slowed, the economic model began to fail. The army still needed to be paid. Borders still needed protection. The bureaucracy kept growing. To cover expenses, taxes increased. Small farmers struggled to survive. Many abandoned their land and moved toward cities or attached themselves to wealthy landowners for protection. The government began reducing the silver content in its coins. Currency lost value. Prices rose. Inflation eroded trust in the system. Trade networks weakened. Infrastructure deteriorated. Rome still looked impressive from the outside, but its financial foundation was becoming unstable. The Roman army had once been made up largely of Roman citizens. Service was tied to identity, duty, and status. By the 5th century, that had changed. Recruiting enough native soldiers became difficult. Population decline, economic hardship, and political instability reduced manpower. Increasingly, Rome relied on federated tribes, groups allowed to settle within the empire in exchange for military service. Many of these soldiers were loyal to their own leaders first, Rome second. Generals of Germanic origin rose to the highest military positions. The empire was defending itself with forces it did not fully control. On paper, the legions still existed. In reality, the structure had fundamentally changed. One of the most decisive blows came quietly. In 429 AD, the Vandals crossed from Spain into North Africa. Within 10 years, they captured Carthage. North Africa was not just another territory. It was one of the wealthiest provinces in the Western Empire. It supplied grain to Italy. It generated major tax revenue. It supported naval control of the Western Mediterranean. When it was lost, the consequences were immediate. The Western government struggled to finance its army. Rome's food supply became vulnerable. Attempts to retake the province failed. This was not a symbolic loss. It permanently weakened the empire's ability to function. In 455 AD, the Vandals sailed to Italy. The Western Empire was too weak to resist effectively. Rome was entered again, this time for 2 weeks. Wealth, treasures, and imperial symbols were carried away. The psychological damage deepened. Rome was no longer the center of unquestioned authority. Power had shifted away from the ancient capital long before this event. But the repeated sackings made one thing clear. The Western Empire could no longer protect its own heart. By the mid-5th century, emperors were often young and politically weak. Real power lay in the hands of military commanders. Figures like Ricimer controlled the Western court without ever taking the imperial title themselves. Emperors were appointed and removed when convenient. The office still existed, but authority was fragmented. Provincial loyalty weakened. Regional leaders acted independently when necessary. The Western Empire was still functioning, but it was functioning through improvisation, not stability. In 476 AD, a coalition of Germanic troops in Italy demanded land and proper compensation. The Western government could not meet those demands. Odoacer, a military leader among them, took control. There was no large-scale resistance. The imperial structure had become too hollow to defend itself. Odoacer did not declare himself emperor. Instead, he ruled Italy as king and acknowledged the authority of the Eastern emperor in Constantinople. It was a political transition more than a dramatic overthrow, but symbolically, it marked the end. When people hear the fall of Rome, they imagine fire, chaos, and a final battle. The reality was quieter and in some ways more unsettling. In 476 AD, the Western emperor was Romulus Augustulus. He was young, likely chosen because he was easy to control. Real authority already belonged to military elites. Odoacer, a Germanic commander serving within the Roman system, led troops stationed in Italy. These soldiers had fought for Rome for years. They demanded land as payment. The Western government refused, not because it was strong, but because it had nothing left to give. Odoacer marched on Ravenna, the Western capital. There was no legendary last stand, no epic defense of civilization. Romulus was deposed and quietly sent into exile. The imperial insignia were sent to the Eastern emperor in Constantinople. This was the key moment. The message was simple. The Western Empire no longer needed its own emperor. Power in the West would now exist without the Roman imperial structure. The collapse was not explosive, it was administrative. A title disappeared, a system dissolved, and almost no one resisted. One of the most surprising aspects of 476 AD is how little opposition there was. The Western Empire had been fragmenting for decades. Large territories were already effectively independent. Spain was under Visigothic control. North Africa belonged to the Vandals. Gaul was divided among various Germanic kingdoms. Britain had been abandoned long before. Italy itself had become the final core. But even there, political authority had shifted toward military leaders. By the time Odoacer acted, the imperial office was symbolic more than functional. The bureaucracy still existed. Roman law still operated. The Senate still met. Daily life did not suddenly collapse in 476. What ended was centralized Western imperial control. The transformation had already happened. 476 was simply the formal acknowledgement that the old structure no longer worked. The fall of the Western Roman Empire was not a single catastrophe. It was a slow accumulation of instability. Political fragmentation weakened authority. Economic strain undermined sustainability. Military dependence on external forces diluted cohesion. Over time, the system stopped reinforcing itself. Institutions remained, but trust in them faded. Borders still existed, but they were no longer secure. Emperors still ruled, but they no longer controlled events. Rome did not collapse in flames. It hollowed out from within. By the time Odoacer removed the last emperor, the structure had already failed. Rome did not fall because it was attacked. It fell because it stopped functioning as Rome.